The year was 1970, and it was just a typical day at Apple Corps headquarters, the relatively new multimedia company owned by the Beatles, headquartered in London. Given that they also had a record label division, it wasn't uncommon for them to receive a ton of demo tapes or acetates from unheard musicians looking to grab their attention and make it big in show business. But amidst all these submitted amateur recordings was one that would begin to baffle music historians over the next 50 years. Rather than being in a pile on a desk, it was found in an office trash can, and rather than being from some aspiring, unknown artist, it was from the Beatles. It simply said, "The Candle Burns, Peace of Mind," by the Beatles. Well, at least that's how the story goes. This was the narrative that spread throughout the early 1970s, the same time that alleged bootleg compilations of Beatles music began circulating among underground collectors, many of which included this strange song. A handful of these bootlegs survive, some copies of the song sounding more clear than others, implying that there is a master recording out there somewhere. You can even hear a copy of the full song on YouTube. It sounds more like a home demo rather than a full studio production, so many parts are a bit muffled.
Looking at the candle burns a flame in the sky. I leave the people laughing. I turn my face to cry.
But despite the song's strange attribution to the Beatles, none of them have any recollection of ever making it. We have absolutely no idea who made this, where it came from, and how it supposedly ended up in the office trash can of the most influential band of all time. Or do we? The composition itself has left many Beatles enthusiasts divided, with some being convinced that it is either John or George on lead vocals, and with others having their doubts. There's very little information out there about what has since been called Peace of Mind, which has led to many educated guesses and theories of its true origins. Despite there being even some incredible leads in the story that could seem rather open and shut, many people are still indecisive and believe that Peace of Mind's true origins have yet to surface. We're going to talk about it all, as well as my own opinions on where this strange road leads. It was really difficult starting somewhere with the song's whole origin story because of just how scattered everything about it is. There really isn't a whole lot known about Peace of Mind other than it was supposedly found in 1970. We don't even know what specific day and month of 1970, or if it was before or after the Beatles broke up. Additionally, there are other claims that while it was supposedly found at this time, the recording itself could date as far back as 1967. There are even some elements of the song itself that could further support this possibility, which we will get into in a minute. But I first want to talk about where the whole trash can story comes from. The strange thing is, we don't really know. The most notable claim of this specific story comes from the You Can't Do That bootleg booklet from 1981 by Charles Reinhardt, which states just that, very bluntly, and with no follow-up information or any kind of elaborating. It doesn't even provide a source for this claim. What's even more interesting to me is that this book is by far the most comprehensive research that's been put together on Peace of Mind, even providing a list of just about every bootleg ever that has included the song as a track. Arguably the most popular of these bootlegs are the titular release, Supertrack 2, and the Beatles 20x4. But I tracked down the fronts and backs of all the bootlegs that I could find that are listed. Yet, I saw nothing about this trash can story popping up. So where does it truly come from? It is possible that this booklet may have gotten the info from one of those circulating vinyl bootlegs on some kind of sleeve note. You know, the writing that sometimes appears inside a vinyl's wrapping to provide context of the music that it contains. Initially, I thought the You Can't Do That booklet was the earliest known source of this claim. But on newspapers.com, I was able to track down an article from 1977 where someone brings up this exact same story. Since it doesn't come from this booklet, It is not far-fetched to assume that one of these bootlegs contained a sleeve note that mentions peace of mind being found in the trash, a sleeve note that is now lost. In fact, some of these bootlegs that are cited seem to have not survived the internet, such as the obscure Apple Slices, supposedly released by a Beatles fan club in the early 70s. As far as I can tell, it is completely lost. So maybe it contained a sleeve note that mentioned this story, but who knows? But even then, why? If the story does come from a vinyl sleeve note, how did it end up there? It does seem like a strangely specific thing for someone to just make up for no reason. One rumor postulated on Steve Hoffman's forums could be that it came from a misremembered detail from the one time Apple Records held open auditions for the public. And this could also even help narrow down when it originated. Now, I say audition for lack of a better term because these weren't in-person musical performances like something out of American Idol, but rather a chance for people to mail in their demo tapes, and Apple Records would listen to them and sign them on if they were good enough. Now, technically, aspiring musicians could have always mailed these tapes to Apple Records at any time, but April of 1968 was the only time where the company actually put ads in the paper looking for unheard talent. Naturally, they received an influx of tape submissions. One of these tapes was from an unknown artist named David Bowie, who Apple Records rejected. But still, the company now had a ton of new musicians that they could potentially sign on, many of which, along with their demo tapes, are now lost to time. Peace of Mind could have very well been one of those tapes that was sent out at that time, which could help narrow it down to this 1968 time window. About a year later, Apple Records signed on a Scottish rock group called White Trash, which later changed their name to just Trash, and they worked together for a brief period. And it was also speculated that they were the ones who were behind the song. Some people online have claimed that these specific details may have been something that was just misremembered. Because these events were close to each other, maybe a bootleg producer at the time just heard someone say that this song was from Trash over at Apple Records, perhaps not knowing that they were referring to the band, and took it literally. It sounds like a bit of a stretch saying it out loud, but at the end of the day, we just don't know where this story comes from. No primary sources for it seem to have survived. But there's a lot of people that think this song is a little bit older than 1970. Even if it actually was found in Apple's trash can at that time, a lot of people think that the recording itself dates to around 1968, or even 1967 at the earliest, and maybe was just thrown out a few years later. In fact, based on my research, most of the bootlegs and booklets that are publicly available actually make this claim a lot more frequently than the trash can one, specifically stating that it was made during the Sgt. Pepper session. Interestingly, I also found another newspaper article from 1987 claiming that the song was written during the same session as It's All Too Much in June of 1967, the exact time Sgt. Pepper was released. Once again, there is no source for this claim, but it's a very specific claim. They must have gotten it from somewhere, right? I think this may have just been an educated guess based on the timeline that many of these bootlegs specify. It's All Too Much was also recorded in June of 1967, so obviously it must have been during the same session. If this was indeed a fake, you could argue that the tricksters behind it most certainly did their homework in making it sound like a Beatles recording specifically from the 1967 era. The attention to detail is to a very impressive degree, especially for a time pre-internet. It wasn't exactly easy to get all this readily available information about the Beatles, especially enough to accurately mimic their rather unique and more candid in-studio eccentricities, particularly the ones from that time. There is a 2006 article from Ear Candy that gives a deep analysis of the song's musical structure. It does a good job at dissecting the song from all angles, but ultimately takes the position that it is indeed a Beatles song. I personally don't think it sounds like the Beatles. Although there are moments where the singing does have a John and George cadence to it, it overall just sounds like an imitation. But like I said, it does do a pretty good job at trying to sound like 1967 era Beatles. If you pay attention to some of the lyrics and interpret them literally, you can catch on to this rather quickly. For example, the lyric, "and lead you to a brand new world that lately has been banned," may be referring to the 1966 ruling that outlawed LSD in Britain. The fact that it's referencing it in a recent context could very well date it to around 1967 or 1966 at the very earliest. Ear Candy proposes a theory that I think is very interesting. That Peace of Mind was essentially a way for the band to really go all out with their drug-addled style of music, only for them to quickly realize that they needed to ease into that. They couldn't just go from the She Loves You mop-top Beatles to the hippie, acid-dropping Beatles overnight. They needed to take a sort of boil the frog approach, so to speak, to adapting this image and style in a way that the public could comfortably digest. The theory further proposes that, for this exact reason, this was likely a song that was made for Revolver, an album which was essentially the perfect gradient between the mop-top early Beatles and the long-hair hippie Beatles. When they realized that the song was too far out, they scrapped it. When they were ready to really embrace that persona, the song's musical elements were repurposed into what would eventually become Dear Prudence on the White Album. Again, this is just someone's theory, not a fact. But upon listening to the song, you can hear a rather distinct guitar playing sound that is rather reminiscent of Dear Prudence. However, it is important to note that the unique guitar picking style that is present on Dear Prudence was something that John learned how to do from Donovan on their trip to India in 1968, which is 1 year after the song was reportedly made. Interestingly, some bootlegs even credit Donovan as a collaborator on this song, weirdly alongside Mike Love. If we were to stick strictly to the Revolver-era narrative that Ear Candy suggests, we can pick up on similar lyrics between Peace of Mind and Tomorrow Never Knows, suggesting a possibility that they were made in tandem. Listen to The Colors of Your Dreams and I Need to Hear the Colors Red and Blue, Existence to the End, Of the Beginning, and Just Before It's Over, It's Really Just Begun, among more examples. The article also notes that most bootleg fake recordings tried to emulate the Beatles' stage persona, the way that they sounded during a loud live performance. This typically sounded more like the rocker, scouse Beatles that we've come to recognize on many of their songs. Peace of Mind is a lot more laid back and calmer, something that sounded very similar to how the Beatles sounded in their home demos, at times strikingly similar. Ear Candy also points out how the singers on Peace of Mind can be heard singing along with the song while doing the backtracks, an unconventional approach to song recording that the article calls a Lennonism. Another thing is Peace of Mind's supposed use of Verispeed to change the overall tone of the song, something that the Beatles experimented with on songs like Strawberry Fields Forever and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Verispeed was not exactly uncommon in the 60s, but when you combine it with the song's use of backwards audio and even a sitar, it starts to sound a lot more like a certain group. What's even more interesting is that pretty much all of these Beatles demo recordings were not publicly available back in the 60s and 70s. So Ear Candy argues that how could a group of people somehow meticulously impersonate this very unique Beatles style that was often only present on their private home demos if they weren't actually the Beatles? But first it was from 1970, then it was from 1968, 1967, 1966. You start to see just how messy and unorganized this timeline is. The information in general is just all over the place, and things get complicated super quickly, which leads me to ultimately rely on Occam's razor. Is this some secret lost Beatles song that's just full of holes and inconsistencies that they, for some reason, just never claimed ownership of? Or is it just the work of some hardcore Beatles fans? It's not unlikely, even then, that this was recorded by musicians who had enough exposure to Beatles media that allowed them to indirectly create something quite similar to the more private recordings of the band. This isn't exactly difficult to do when you are creating a song that is more of a stream of consciousness, which is what Peace of Mind ultimately is. And this wasn't just a Beatles thing. It was becoming quite common in the 60s in general. Some bootlegs even labeled this as an early Pink Floyd song, particularly with Syd Barrett on vocals. Although it sounds somewhat similar in composition to some of their other songs like Crumbling Land, that was also from after Syd already left the band. And the similarities, in my opinion, are enough to really be striking. With so much unconfirmed, vague, and unreliable information, the true creators of the song naturally became a subject of hot debate over several decades. If it wasn't the Beatles, the musicians behind Peace of Mind were a complete mystery. But then in 2010, something amazing happened. A YouTube comment from a user named Walton Jones 3 appeared on one of these uploads of the song, claiming that he knew where the song came from because he wrote the song. Now, this original YouTube comment appears to be lost, so I could not provide any screenshots of it. But there are online forums from the time talking about it, and one supposed direct quote. Walton Jones is a retired university professor of theater from Colorado. Back in the 60s, he worked with a man named David Hunter at a local radio station out in Florida called WUSF. This radio station had a special programming block called the Underground Railroad, which played the grooviest and hippest progressive rock tracks, along with some host commentary. Of course, many of these tracks were from the Beatles. Walton Jones claimed that he and David Hunter were the ones who recorded the song and played it on this station as a sort of college prank. Essentially a way for them to get more listeners to tune into the station because they had a never-before-heard Lost Beatles track, which I think is quite brilliant. But as interesting and big of a lead as this was, people were still quite skeptical. After all, a YouTube comment alone is not a reliable source, as anyone can just claim anything. And at the time, that was really the only information available. I was initially skeptical of this claim, but once again, I was able to find on newspapers.com an article from 1971 in Florida for a radio station called WUSF. And sure enough, David Hunter and Walton Jones are mentioned as being weekly scheduled hosts. I think this is a huge lead in this entire thing. But then in 2021, over a decade later, one of these radio segments from 1969 was uploaded to SoundCloud, and you could say that it effectively solved the entire Peace of Mind mystery. The source was someone who reportedly had connections with David Hunter and Walton Jones. Sure enough, the audio features both Hunter and Jones talking about receiving a cassette in the mail labeled Peace of Mind, spelled P-I-E-C-E, a cassette from an unknown source that claimed it was recorded by the Beatles during an acid trip. This would explain where the name of the song came from, as no lyrics of it are ever mentioned. They also claim that this is a copy and not the master. But still, the radio segment features a much clearer quality of the song than pretty much any other bootleg that's surfaced, meaning that if it is indeed not the master, it is at least one of the earliest generational copies. I turn my face to cry. Over the years, perhaps someone got a hold of this tape, gave it to some bootleg distributors, and a game of telephone quickly started with all of its supposed strange origins. Wow! In my opinion, this is pretty much open and shut that Walton Jones and David Hunter are the ones who created Peace of Mind. The evidence is just too specific, detailed, and really compelling to not be them. The fact that this radio segment from the 60s was able to surface is really quite incredible. For these reasons, I do believe that Peace of Mind is now solved. But of course, even with all these very detailed and backed up receipts, there are still some who are not fully convinced. While researching this, I actually came across a pretty humorous edit war on Wikipedia, claiming that the SoundCloud upload is not a reliable source or that it could even be quote-unquote fake evidence. I think this would be a very complicated thing to fake, especially pre-AI. Again, I found an actual, verifiable newspaper article from the 1970s acknowledging David Hunter and Walton Jones as real people who were indeed part of this radio station at this time. Given that this is a station dedicated to rock and roll and music for the youth, it makes perfect sense that these two would be knowledgeable enough about the Beatles to make a rather convincing fake. Heck, one of their voices at the very beginning even sounds a lot like George Harrison speaking, at least in my opinion.
Maharishi, Brian Epstein's death.
The only inconsistency in the story that I could really find is to, no surprise, the timeline. In this radio broadcast, Hunter claims that the Peace of Mind tape was sent to him around the time that Strawberry Fields was released, so in 1967. However, Hunter's very comment on that same SoundCloud page claims that he and Jones had created the recording earlier that day, even though this allegedly is a broadcast from late 1969. And the fact that they are referring to Strawberry Fields in the distant past tense adds credence to that. How could they have recorded a song in 1969 that they apparently got a hold of in 1967? Although it is a bit strange, I do think there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. I think this was likely just a thing that the two made up. They did indeed record the song that day, but claimed to have obtained it in 1967 to make the story sound more interesting and perhaps make it more accurately depict the kind of Beatles material that was readily available at that time. Given that this was a local station, if someone listening to this broadcast didn't remember hearing that song on the station prior to 1969, they might think that they just missed that broadcast and not put much thought into it. Intentionally muddying the waters to make the tape source seem much more distant than it really was adds a bit of plausible deniability. Not saying that's definitively what happened, but it does make sense. The other possibility is that this was almost 60 years ago. It's possible that they just forgot certain details. I know Wikipedia can be a bit red tape when it comes to constituting what a reliable source is, and I do understand that, given that they want their documentation to have as much integrity as possible. Having said that, Peace of Mind is already a very niche topic. It's not exactly something that has been extensively covered by A-list news outlets, so I don't think adding another source with this very detailed and convincing information would exactly hurt. Perhaps there is something I'm missing here, but from what I can tell, this is basically solved. Lastly, I think the most telling thing that it's not the Beatles is because you'd think it would have just been copyrighted by now. I know that sounds more like a humorous reason, but it's not far-fetched. In case you didn't know, Beatles music is notorious for constantly getting removed for copyright infringement, way more than other musicians, especially on YouTube. At this point, John Lennon's farts are content ID'd. If this was indeed an actual Beatles song, I am almost positive that it would have been taken down by now, or even included in some kind of Beatles anthology release. But maybe there is still a handful of people who want to believe that this is indeed a lost Beatles recording, because it's just so much more interesting that way. Like how a certain band member mysteriously died in 1966. At any rate, I am glad that Peace of Mind was able to become a sizable part of Beatles history, at least in one way or another. If you would like more Beatles content, please subscribe and let me know what you would like to see next. You can also check out my other channel here, all about technology and history. Thank you for watching, everyone.